The red sun of Kepler 442 cast long shadows across the mining fields where thousands of alien workers bent their backs under the watchful eyes of Vorthak guards. The air was thick with dust and fear. Every movement was controlled. Every breath was monitored. Every thought was dangerous. Thyla pressed her blue-scaled hands against the rough metal of her mining cart and tried not to think about her daughter. The Zilani had learned long ago that their telepathic abilities made them vulnerable to the Vorthak mind readers who patrolled the work sites. One stray thought about rebellion, one memory of freedom, and the punishment would be swift and public. The sound of boots on metal made every worker freeze. Commander Zexel approached with his usual cruel smile, his forearms gesturing as he spoke to his subordinates. The Vorthak stood nearly 8 feet tall, their gray skin marked with ritual scars that told stories of conquest. Their yellow eyes missed nothing. "Today marks another glorious year of Vorthak rule," Zexel announced, his voice carrying across the mining site through mechanical amplifiers. 17 species serve the Imperium. 17 species have learned the price of resistance. Thyla kept her eyes down, but felt the familiar weight of despair settle on her shoulders. She had been 15 when the Vorthak arrived on Zilani Prime. That was 30 years ago. Her own daughter had never known freedom, had never seen the crystal cities that once sparkled under their home world's twin moons. Across the mining field, Vexmon adjusted his breathing mask and continued loading heavy ore containers onto transport vehicles. The Korath engineer had once designed starships that could cross galaxies in weeks. Now he lifted rocks 12 hours a day. His people's natural skill with technology had made them valuable slaves, but slaves nonetheless. The Vorthak had a simple system. They would arrive at a world with overwhelming force. Massive ships would fill the sky, blocking out the sun. Then came the demonstrations. Cities would burn. Populations would be herded into viewing areas to watch their leaders executed in ways that would haunt their dreams forever. The message was always clear: submit or die. But it was not just the killing that broke civilizations. It was the systematic destruction of hope. The Vorthak would identify each species' greatest cultural treasures and destroy them. They would separate families and relocate populations. They would take the children and raise them to serve the Imperium, forgetting their own heritage. On 17 worlds across this sector of the galaxy, the pattern had been the same. The Vorthak would demand tribute, slaves, and absolute obedience. Any sign of resistance would result in public executions, broadcast across entire star systems. Other species would watch and learn that defiance meant death. Commander Zexel walked among the workers, occasionally stopping to examine their progress, his yellow eyes fixed on a young Korath who had paused to wipe sweat from his brow. "You seem tired," Zexel said, his voice deceptively soft. "Perhaps you need motivation." The commander gestured to his guards, who immediately seized the young worker. Other aliens stopped their tasks, knowing they were about to witness another lesson in Vorthak authority. The guards dragged the struggling Korath to the center of the worksite, where a raised platform stood permanently erected for such demonstrations. Thyla closed her eyes but could not block out the sounds that followed. This was how the Vorthak maintained control. Not through military might alone, but through the constant reminder that any one of them could be next. Fear was their most effective weapon. When the screaming stopped, Commander Zexel addressed the silent crowd of workers. "The Imperium is eternal," he declared. "Your worlds fell because you were weak. Your people serve because service is your only value. Remember this when you dream of rebellion. Remember what happened to the others who thought they could resist. The workers returned to their tasks in silence. Above them, Vorthak patrol ships moved across the sky like mechanical vultures, their sensors constantly scanning for signs of unrest. In the distance, the massive fortress that housed the planetary command center rose like a mountain of metal and spite. But in the deep mines where the guards rarely ventured, whispered conversations continued. Thyla found herself working near Vexmon as they loaded a transport cart together. "My daughter asks me why the sky used to be blue on our world," she said quietly, her telepathic abilities carefully shielded. "I tell her stories, but she thinks they are just fairy tales." Vexmon's breathing mask hissed softly as he replied, "My grandson has never seen a Korath starship. He believes we have always been slaves. Sometimes I think he is the lucky one." These small moments of shared grief were all the resistance they dared. The Vorthak had broken every organized rebellion across 17 worlds. They had technologies that could read minds, detect lies, and predict uprisings before they began. They had turned entire species into informants against their own people. As the work shift continued, neither Thyla nor Vexmon noticed the small device hidden among the mining equipment. It was barely larger than a coin, its surface dark and unreflective. The device had been placed there by a scout probe that had entered the system 3 days earlier, moving so quietly that even Vorthak's sensors had missed it. The device was recording everything: the suffering, the oppression, the systematic destruction of hope across 17 civilizations. But most importantly, it was transmitting a signal into deep space, carrying with it a simple message that would change everything. The message was a distress call, sent on frequencies that only one species in the galaxy had ever used. It carried coordinates, tactical data, and a plea for help from civilizations that had given up on the possibility of rescue. Far beyond the edge of the Kepler system, something was listening. Something was coming. Something that had never learned to bow to fear. The red sun continued its path across the alien sky, casting the same shadows it had for 30 years of Vorthak rule. But for the first time in 3 decades, change was coming to Kepler 442b. The workers could not know it yet, but their message had been received. In the cold depths of space, a human battleship had just altered course toward their system. The USS Vengeance dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system like a thunderclap in the void. 2 miles long and bristling with weapons, the human dreadnought was a testament to Earth's military engineering. Its dark hull absorbed light rather than reflecting it, making the ship appear as a hole in space itself. Captain Jake Morrison stood on the bridge, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the tactical display. The information was overwhelming. 14 Vorthak capital ships orbited the main planet, with dozens of smaller vessels patrolling the system's outer reaches. It was the largest concentration of enemy forces any human had ever encountered. "Sir, we're being scanned," reported Lieutenant Amanda Foster from the communications station. Her fingers moved across her controls as she analyzed the incoming signals. "Multiple sources. They know we're here." Commander Lisa Harper stepped up beside Morrison, her dark eyes fixed on the tactical readout. "Captain, I count over 200 Vorthak vessels in this system. Our intelligence reports were conservative." Morrison nodded slowly. The USS Vengeance was powerful, perhaps the most advanced warship ever constructed by human hands. But it was still just one ship against an entire fleet. The logical decision would be to retreat, call for reinforcements, and return with a proper battle group. but the distress signal they had intercepted told a different story. 17 civilizations had been enslaved. Billions of beings lived under Vorthak oppression with no hope of rescue. How long would it take to assemble a fleet? How many more would die while they waited? Incoming transmission, Foster announced. It's on all frequencies, maximum power. They want us to hear this. The main screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of a Vorthak command ship. Admiral Krextar filled the display, his forearms spread wide in a gesture of dominance. Behind him, the bodies of recently executed prisoners hung from metal hooks, a deliberate display meant to intimidate. Unknown vessel, Krextar's voice boomed through the bridge speakers. You have entered Imperium space without authorization. I am Admiral Krextar, Supreme Commander of the Kepler Sector. You will power down your weapons and prepare to be boarded. Morrison stepped forward, his expression calm. Open a channel, Foster nodded. Channel open, sir. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the Earth starship USS Vengeance, he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had earned him command of humanity's most advanced warship. We received a distress call from this system. Krextar's yellow eyes narrowed. Human. Yes. We have heard of your species. A small, primitive civilization. On the galaxy's outer rim, you have made a grave error in judgment, Captain Morrison. The Vorthak Admiral gestured to his subordinates, and the camera angle shifted to show the hangar deck of his flagship. Thousands of alien prisoners were chained together in neat rows, their faces showing the despair of 30 years under Vorthak rule. Morrison recognized several species from the intelligence files he had studied. Behold the fate of those who oppose the Imperium, Krextar continued. 17 civilizations learned this lesson. Today, you will learn it as well. Morrison watched the display in silence for a long moment. He had seen the reports, read the intelligence summaries, but witnessing the reality of Vorthak cruelty was different. These beings had once ruled worlds, built cities, created art and literature. Now they were cattle, broken by decades of systematic oppression. I see you understand, Krextar said, misinterpreting Morrison's silence. Surrender, now, and your death will be quick. Resist, and you will join these creatures in a very long and educational experience. Captain Morrison looked around his bridge. His crew was watching him, waiting for orders. These men and women had volunteered to serve on the most dangerous assignment in the human fleet. They had trained for years to operate the experimental systems that made the USS Vengeance possible. More importantly, they were human. They carried with them the accumulated weight of their species' history. Every war fought for freedom, every battle won against impossible odds, every time their ancestors had chosen to stand rather than kneel. Admiral Krextar, Morrison said finally, his voice cutting through the static of interstellar communication. Let me share something with you about humans. We have a saying on Earth, the only thing necessary for evil to triumph is for good people to do nothing. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Today, you learn what happens when humans choose to do something. Morrison gestured to Foster, who cut the communication channel. The bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of the ship's systems. On the tactical display, Vorthak ships were beginning to move, forming attack formations that had conquered 17 worlds. All hands, this is the captain, Morrison announced over the ship's communication system. We came to this system following a distress call. We found something worse than we imagined. 17 civilizations have been enslaved by the Vorthak Imperium. Billions of people have lived their entire lives under oppression, believing that rescue would never come. His voice carried to every corner of the ship, reaching 800 crew members who had sworn to defend humanity and its values. The Vorthak rule through fear. They believe that superior numbers and brutal tactics make them invincible. Today, they discover what human military engineering can accomplish when motivated by righteous anger. Battle stations. The USS Vengeance came alive as its crew moved to combat positions. In engineering, Chief Tony Martinez brought the ship's revolutionary power systems online. The quantum reactors that drove the ship could generate more energy than most civilizations used in a year. On the weapon decks, crews prepared the experimental cannon systems that had made the USS Vengeance possible. These were not the simple, projectile weapons that most species used in space combat. Human military scientists had developed something entirely new, based on principles that other species had dismissed as impossible. Commander Harper moved to her tactical station, her fingers dancing across controls that could coordinate the ship's defensive systems. The USS Vengeance carried shielding technology that could deflect energy weapons and absorb kinetic impacts that would destroy lesser vessels. "Captain," she reported, "all systems are green. We are ready for combat." Morrison nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display. The Vorthak fleet was moving into position, confident that their overwhelming numerical advantage would end this quickly. They had used the same tactics for centuries, and those tactics had never failed, but they had never faced humans before. "Take us in, Commander Harper," Morrison ordered. "Show them what one human ship can do." The USS Vengeance began its approach toward Kepler 442b, its dark hull cutting through space like a blade. Behind it, 800 human beings prepared to write a new chapter in galactic history. On the surface of the planet below, Thyla felt something she had not experienced in 30 years. Hope. Chief Tactical Officer Ryan Clark studied the incoming data with the focused intensity that had made him the youngest person ever promoted to his position. The Vorthak fleet was impressive in size, but as he analyzed their ship designs, patterns began to emerge that troubled him for entirely different reasons than expected. "Captain," he said, turning from his console, "I'm seeing some interesting details about their fleet composition." Morrison moved to stand behind Clark's station. The tactical officer had a reputation for finding weaknesses that others missed, a skill that had saved human lives in previous engagements with hostile aliens. "What do you have, Ryan?" Clark highlighted several ships on the display. "Look at the power signatures from their largest vessels. These ships are designed to look intimidating, but their actual firepower is surprisingly limited. Most of their energy goes to maintaining those oversized hulls and running what appear to be psychological warfare systems." The captain studied the data. "Psychological warfare?" "Yes, sir. Notice how every ship has massive external displays, powerful broadcast systems, and what our sensors identify as fear-inducement equipment. They're built to terrify enemies into surrender rather than fight actual battles." Commander Harper joined the discussion. "That would explain how they conquered 17 civilizations without taking significant losses. Most species probably surrendered before any real fighting began." At the communications station, Lieutenant Amanda Foster was monitoring multiple frequencies, her trained ear picking up signals that the ship's automated systems might miss. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Captain, I'm intercepting communications from the planet's surface," she reported. "Some are in languages our computers can translate. Sir, they're not military communications. They're civilians begging for help." Morrison felt a knot form in his stomach. Put them through the speakers. The bridge filled with voices speaking in a dozen different alien languages. The translation software worked quickly, converting the desperate pleas into English. Please, anyone who can hear this, we are the last survivors of the Korath Engineering Guild. Our children have never seen freedom. If there is anyone out there who fights for justice, please remember us. This is Thyla of the Zalani Resistance. We have maintained hope for 30 years that someone would come. If you are listening, know that we tried to be worthy of rescue. My name is Vexmon. I once built ships that could travel between stars. Now I break rocks in mines. But I still remember how to fight if someone would give us a chance. The messages continued, each one a small piece of a larger tragedy. Foster's hands trembled as she adjusted the controls, trying to isolate individual signals from the chaos of overlapping transmissions. There are thousands of them, Captain, she whispered. Men, women, children from species we've never even heard of. They've been sending these messages for years, hoping someone would listen. Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. These people had been forgotten by the galaxy, written off as acceptable losses in the Vorthak expansion. No one had come to help them, because no one believed they could be helped. Foster, can you establish two-way communication with any of them? Working. On it, sir. The Vorthak are jamming most frequencies, but I might be able to punch through on some of the lower bands. While Foster worked, Ryan Clark continued his analysis of the Vorthak fleet. What he found confirmed his suspicions and revealed something even more disturbing. Captain, I've identified their command structure. The ships are arranged in a fear formation designed to maximize psychological impact. But there's something else. I'm detecting execution chambers on most of their vessels. Execution chambers? Mobile execution facilities, sir. They don't just kill people planetside. They bring victims up to their ships and broadcast the executions across entire systems. It's a deliberate terror campaign. The bridge fell silent as the implications sank in. This was not a military force in any traditional sense. The Vorthak had built an empire on fear, using their fleet as a mobile platform for systematic psychological torture. Sir, Foster announced, I've established contact with someone on the surface. It's weak, but I can maintain the link. Put them through. The voice that came through the speakers was female, speaking accented but clear English that suggested advanced education. This is Thyla of the Zalani. Who am I speaking with? Morrison stepped forward. This is Captain Jake Morrison of the human vessel USS Vengeance. We received your distress call. There was a long pause before Thyla responded, her voice filled with disbelief. Human? You're human? But humans are just myths, stories told by travelers from the outer rim. We're real, and we're here to help. Captain Morrison, Thyla's voice grew urgent, you must leave this system immediately. The Vorthak fleet is massive. They have technologies that can read minds, predict strategies, break the will of entire civilizations. No single ship can stand against them. Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. Each one reflected the same determination he felt burning in his chest. Thyla, how long have your people been enslaved? 30 years, Captain. 30 years of watching our friends die, our children raised as servants, our culture erased piece by piece. And in those 30 years, has anyone come to help you? Another pause. No, Captain. No one has come. Then it's time someone did, Morrison said firmly. Thyla, I want you to get word to every resistance group, every survivor, every person who still believes in freedom. Tell them that today is different. Tell them humans don't abandon people who need help." Clark looked up from his station. "Captain, the Vorthak fleet is moving into their standard intimidation formation, 200 ships arranged in a sphere, designed to make their target feel surrounded and hopeless. How long until they're in weapon range?" 15 minutes, sir." Morrison turned to Commander Harper. "Lisa, I want you to analyze every detail of their approach. These ships were designed to fight enemies who would be terrified into submission. We're not those enemies." Harper nodded, her fingers flying over her controls. "Already on it, Captain. Their formation prioritizes visual impact over tactical effectiveness. They're leaving gaps that a properly coordinated attack could exploit. On the planet below, Thyla had spread the word through the hidden networks that connected the enslaved populations. The news traveled through mine shafts and work camps, passed along by telepathic whispers and carefully coded messages. A human ship had come. Not a fleet, not an armada, but a single vessel crewed by people who had chosen to fight rather than ignore the suffering of others. For the first time in 30 years, something had changed in the Kepler system. In the deepest mines, Vexmon felt his hearts beating faster as he shared the news with his fellow Korath workers. They had maintained their engineering knowledge in secret, passing technical skills from one generation to the next despite Vorthak prohibitions. "If the humans can break the Vorthak fleet," he whispered to his companions, "we will be ready to fight." Above them all, the USS Vengeance continued its steady approach toward Kepler 442b. Captain Morrison stood at the center of his bridge, surrounded by officers who had volunteered for the most dangerous mission in human space. "All stations report." "Ready, Captain?" Harper announced. Morrison nodded, his eyes fixed on the tactical display where 200 Vorthak ships waited in their fear formation. "Then let's show them what happens when someone refuses to be afraid." The USS Vengeance entered the Vorthak formation like a dark arrow piercing through a wall of light. 200 enemy ships surrounded the human vessel, their hulls blazing with intimidating displays and psychological warfare broadcasts. Admiral Krekstar had positioned his fleet in the traditional sphere that had broken the will of 17 civilizations, but Captain Morrison was not watching the light show. His attention was focused on the tactical data streaming across his displays, information that revealed the true nature of Vorthak military doctrine. "Ryan, confirm your analysis of their weapon systems," he ordered. Chief Tactical Officer Ryan Clark's fingers moved rapidly across his controls. "Confirmed, Captain. Their primary weapons are designed for orbital bombardment and terror attacks against civilian populations. Most of their ships carry minimal anti-ship weaponry." Commander Lisa Harper coordinated the USS Vengeance's defensive systems from her station, her trained eye analyzing the enemy formation for weaknesses. "Captain, they're broadcasting on multiple frequencies, trying to overload our communication systems and induce psychological effects in the crew. Can you block it?" "Already done, sir. Our shielding includes mental protection protocols. Whatever they're transmitting can't affect human brain chemistry." Morrison allowed himself a slight smile. Human military engineers had learned long ago to prepare for unconventional warfare. The USS Vengeance had been designed to fight enemies who might use biological, chemical, or psychological weapons. The Vorthak terror broadcasts were simply noise against the ship's advanced defenses. "All weapons, target the command vessels," Morrison ordered. "We're not here to destroy their fleet. We're here to break their system of control." In the ship's engineering section, Chief Tony Martinez monitored the quantum reactors that powered the USS Vengeance's revolutionary weapon systems. The energy output was staggering. more than enough to power a small city, but channeling that power into weapons that could function in the chaos of space combat required precise engineering and perfect timing. "Captain," Martinez reported over the communication system, "all power systems are optimal. Quantum cannons are charged and ready." The quantum cannons were humanity's answer to the problem of space warfare. Traditional projectile weapons were too slow, energy beams too easily deflected. But quantum manipulation could affect matter at the subatomic level, disrupting the fundamental forces that held enemy ships together. "Fire," Morrison commanded. The USS Vengeance's main weapons discharged with a sound like reality tearing apart. Invisible beams of quantum energy reached across space, targeting the largest Vorthak command ships with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The first target, Admiral Krextar's flagship, shuddered as its primary power systems simply stopped working. Not destroyed, not damaged, but fundamentally altered at the quantum level until they could no longer function. The massive ship went dark, its intimidating displays failing as emergency power struggled to maintain basic life support. "Direct hit on the command vessel," Clark reported. "Their main power grid is offline. They're dead in space." But Morrison's strategy was more complex than simply disabling individual ships. He had studied human military history, learning from generals who had faced overwhelming odds and found ways to turn superior numbers into a disadvantage. "Harper, initiate the scatter protocol." Commander Harper executed a maneuver that would have been impossible for any ship not designed by human engineers. The USS Vengeance's advanced propulsion systems allowed it to change direction and acceleration in ways that defied the expectations of enemies trained to fight more conventional opponents. The human ship suddenly accelerated directly toward the center of the Vorthak formation, then split its vector into multiple directions using momentum manipulation technology. To the enemy sensors, it appeared as if the single ship had somehow become three separate vessels, each moving in impossible patterns. "They're trying to track our movement," Clark observed. "Their targeting systems can't compensate for our acceleration changes." The Vorthak fleet, designed to surround and intimidate a stationary target, found itself struggling to coordinate against an opponent that refused to behave according to their tactical assumptions. Ships that had been perfectly positioned to create psychological pressure were now scattered across too wide an area to provide mutual support. Morrison's next target was the communication hub that coordinated the fleet's psychological warfare systems. Another quantum cannon blast disrupted the vessel's transmission equipment, cutting off the terror broadcasts that had kept enslaved populations in despair for decades. On the planet below, Thyla felt the change immediately. The constant background noise of Vorthak propaganda, the subliminal fear signals that had been part of daily life for 30 years, suddenly went silent. "The broadcasts have stopped," she whispered into her communication device. "The fear signals are gone." Across the planet, millions of enslaved beings experienced something they had almost forgotten. The oppressive weight of artificial terror lifted from their minds, replaced by a clarity of thought they had not felt since childhood. In the mines, Vexmon straightened his back for the first time in years. "My friends," he announced to his fellow Korath workers, "I remember what it feels like to think clearly, and I remember how to build weapons." The USS Vengeance continued its devastating assault on the Vorthak command structure. Captain Morrison's strategy was precise. Disable the ships that coordinated the fleet's activities while avoiding unnecessary destruction of life. Each quantum cannon shot targeted critical systems rather than crew compartments. "Their formation is collapsing," Harper reported. Without central coordination, they're falling back on individual ship protocols. This was exactly what Morrison had hoped for. The Vorthak system depended on centralized control and coordinated intimidation. Remove those elements, and their overwhelming numerical advantage became a weakness, as hundreds of ships tried to operate independently in the same space. A group of Vorthak destroyers attempted to execute a coordinated attack on the human vessel, firing their orbital bombardment weapons in a pattern designed to overwhelm the USS Vengeance's shields. But these weapons, optimized for destroying civilian targets, were ineffective against military-grade defenses. "Minimal damage to outer shield layers," Harper announced. "Their weapons can't penetrate our defensive systems." Morrison realized that the Vorthak had never fought an enemy capable of defending itself. Their entire military doctrine was based on attacking defenseless targets and using fear to prevent organized resistance. Against an opponent that could both defend and attack effectively, they had no viable strategy. "Tony, can you give me more power to the quantum cannons?" Morrison asked. "Affirmative, Captain. Rerouting power from non-essential systems now." The next barrage from the USS Vengeance targeted 6 Vorthak vessels simultaneously, their quantum beams disrupting propulsion and communication systems across a wide area. The enemy ships found themselves unable to maneuver or coordinate effectively, removed from the battle without being destroyed. "Captain," Clark said, his voice filled with amazement, "we've disabled 37 enemy vessels. Their entire command structure is offline. The remaining ships are requesting instructions that no one can provide." Morrison watched the tactical display as the Vorthak formation continued to collapse. Ships that had been perfectly arranged to create maximum psychological impact were now scattered and confused, their crews trained for intimidation rather than actual combat. But more importantly, he could see the changes beginning on the planet below. The communication intercepts showed increased activity among the enslaved populations, coordinated movements that suggested organized resistance was forming for the first time in decades. "This is just the beginning," Morrison said quietly. "We're not just fighting a battle, we're breaking a system." As the Vorthak command ships drifted powerless in space, something unprecedented began happening on the surface of Kepler 442b. For 30 years, the enslaved populations had lived under constant surveillance and psychological suppression. But with the fear broadcasts silenced and the orbital command structure in chaos, a spark of rebellion began to spread. Dr. Karen Price, the USS Vengeance's xenobiologist, worked frantically at her station to establish communication protocols with the various species on the planet. Her expertise in alien biology and psychology made her the ideal person to coordinate with beings who had been broken by decades of oppression. "Captain, I'm receiving multiple signals from the surface," she reported. "The enslaved populations are organizing faster than I thought possible. It's as if they were just waiting for the psychological pressure to lift." Captain Morrison moved to stand beside her console. "What are they telling you?" "The Zilani are using their natural telepathic abilities to coordinate resistance cells across the planet. The Korath engineers are somehow accessing hidden weapon caches they've been building in secret for years, and there are at least 15 other species, all starting to move at once." On the planet below, Thyla felt the change in her people's minds like a physical sensation. For 3 decades, the Vorthak fear broadcasts had created a constant background of despair and hopelessness. Now that silence had been replaced by something her people had not experienced since before the conquest. Unified purpose. Using her telepathic abilities, she reached out to Zilani communities across the planet. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Thousands of minds touched hers, each carrying the same message. We are ready to fight. In the deep mining tunnels, Vexmon gathered his fellow Korath engineers around him. These beings had once built starships capable of crossing the galaxy, but they had been forced to hide their technical knowledge for 30 years. Now, with the Vorthak distracted by the battle in orbit, it was time to reveal what they had been preparing. "My friends," he announced quietly, "for 30 years we have pretended to be broken. We have acted as if our spirits were crushed. But we never stopped being engineers." He led them to a section of the mine that appeared to be a standard ore processing facility. But when Vexmon activated hidden controls built into the rock walls, the floor began to slide away, revealing a vast underground workshop. The chamber was filled with weapons, communication equipment, and even small vehicles, all built from materials carefully salvaged over decades of apparent servitude. "How did you keep this hidden from the Vorthak scanners?" asked one of the younger Korath. "We used their own fear against them," Vexmon replied. "They were so confident that we were broken that they never looked carefully at what we were actually doing. They saw us moving rocks and assumed we were just following orders. They never realized we were building a resistance." Similar scenes were playing out across the planet as 17 different species revealed the preparations they had been making in secret. The Vorthak system of control had been so focused on psychological dominance that they had missed the physical preparation for rebellion happening right under their sensors. Above them, the battle in space continued as Captain Morrison adapted his strategy to support the uprising on the planet. The USS Vengeance had disabled most of the Vorthak command structure, but dozens of smaller patrol vessels remained operational. "Ryan, I need you to identify any Vorthak ships that might threaten the civilian populations," Morrison ordered. Chief Tactical Officer Ryan Clark highlighted several vessels on the tactical display. "These 6 ships are loaded with orbital bombardment weapons. If they reach attack positions over the population centers, they could kill thousands in retaliation for the uprising. Then we don't let them reach attack positions. Harper, plot. Intercept courses for all 6 vessels." Commander Lisa Harper's fingers flew over her controls as she calculated the complex orbital mechanics needed to intercept multiple targets simultaneously. "Course plotted, Captain, but we'll need to divide our fire across 6 different vectors. It's going to be close." The USS Vengeance accelerated toward the first bombardment ship, its quantum cannons charging for another precisely targeted attack. But this time, the enemy was ready. The Vorthak captain had realized that his vessel's terror weapons were useless against the human ship and had repositioned to use his orbital cannons as anti-ship weapons. "Incoming fire," Harper announced. "Multiple projectiles, kinetic and energy weapons." The human ship's shields flared as they absorbed the impact of weapons designed to destroy cities. The power drain was significant, but the advanced defensive systems held. "Shields at 75%, Harper reported. "We can take a few more hits like that." Morrison's response was swift and decisive. The quantum cannons fired in sequence, targeting not the enemy ship's weapons, but its navigation systems. The Vorthak vessel found itself unable to adjust its orbit, locked into a trajectory that would carry it away from the planet. The second bombardment ship tried a different approach, accelerating directly toward the planet's surface in an attempt to complete its attack run before the USS Vengeance could intervene, but the human ship's superior speed and maneuverability allowed it to intercept the enemy vessel, disabling its engines with a precisely placed quantum beam. Meanwhile, on the planet's surface, the coordinated uprising was gaining momentum. Thyla had established communication with resistance leaders from all 17 enslaved species, and they were sharing intelligence and resources in ways that had been impossible under Vorthok surveillance. "The mining facility in Sector 7 has been liberated," she reported to Dr. Price through their communication link. "Vexmon's people have weapons and are moving to secure the spaceport." "What about Vorthak ground forces?" Dr. Price asked. "They're in chaos. Without orders from orbit, most of their commanders don't know how to respond to organized resistance. Some are retreating to fortified positions. Others are trying to execute hostages to restore fear, but our people are moving too fast." This was exactly what Captain Morrison had hoped to achieve. The Vorthak system depended entirely on centralized control and psychological dominance. Remove those elements, and their seemingly overwhelming military advantage collapsed. The third and fourth bombardment ships attempted a coordinated attack, approaching the planet from different angles to divide the USS Vengeance's attention. But Morrison had anticipated this tactic. "Tony, can you give me a 30-second overcharge on the quantum cannons?" he asked. Chief Engineer Tony Martinez's voice came back tense with concentration. "That's beyond design specifications, Captain. We might damage the quantum matrix. Can you do it?" "Yes, sir. Initiating overcharge sequence now." The USS Vengeance's weapon systems drew power from the ship's quantum reactors at levels that made the engineering displays flash warning colors. For 30 seconds, the human vessel possessed firepower that exceeded anything ever mounted on a starship. Both enemy vessels disappeared in flashes of disrupted matter as quantum beams tore through their hulls at the subatomic level. The remaining bombardment ships, seeing the fate of their companions, immediately changed course away from the planet. "All bombardment vessels neutralized or retreating," Clark reported. "The civilian populations are safe from orbital attack." But the real victory was happening on the surface, where 17 civilizations were rediscovering what it meant to be free. The Vorthak ground forces, trained to control populations through fear rather than fight actual battles, found themselves overwhelmed by coordinated resistance from beings they had thought were broken. In the capital city, Zalani telepaths coordinated simultaneous attacks on Vorthak communication centers. In the industrial zones, Korath engineers used their technical skills to turn mining equipment into weapons of liberation. Across the planet, species that had been enemies before the Vorthak conquest were working together against their common oppressor. "Captain," Dr. Price announced, "I'm receiving reports from all over the planet. The uprising is succeeding beyond our most optimistic projections. The Vorthak ground forces are requesting evacuation." Morrison felt a surge of satisfaction, but he knew the battle was far from over. Breaking the Vorthak hold on one planet was significant, but their empire spanned multiple star systems. The real test would come when Admiral Krextar's superiors learned what had happened here. "Thyla," he said into the communication link, "this is just the beginning. When news of this reaches other Vorthak territories, they're going to send reinforcements. Are your people ready for a longer fight?" The Zalani leader's response carried the determination of someone who had waited 30 years for this moment. "Captain Morrison, we have been slaves for 3 decades. We know what freedom costs, and we're willing to pay that price." Admiral Krextar floated in the emergency command center of his crippled flagship, his 4 arms trembling with rage as he watched his empire crumble around him. The human ship had done more than disable his fleet. It had destroyed the foundation of Vorthak power: fear. Reports streamed in from across the planet as his ground commanders described impossible situations. Populations that had been docile for 30 years were suddenly coordinating complex military operations. Species that had been broken by decades of psychological warfare were working together with efficiency that suggested years of secret planning. "Admiral," his communications officer reported, "Commander Zexel is requesting immediate evacuation from the mining complex. He says the slaves have weapons and are moving to surround his position." Krextar's yellow eyes fixed on the tactical display showing the human battleship systematically dismantling his carefully constructed formation. One ship, one impossible ship had undone 30 years of conquest. "Send word to High Command," he ordered. "Request immediate reinforcements from the 3rd and 5th Fleets. Sir, our long-range communications are still offline. The human ship's first attack destroyed our quantum relay systems." The Admiral realized with growing horror that his situation was even worse than he had imagined. Not only was his fleet defeated, but he could not call for help or report what had happened. The humans had isolated the system completely, but Krextar had not conquered 17 civilizations by accepting defeat easily. If he could not call for help, he would send a message that the entire galaxy would understand. He would make the cost of defying the Vorthak so terrible that no other species would dare follow humanity's example. "Prepare the execution vessels," he commanded. "All of them." His subordinates looked at him with confusion. "Sir, which prisoners should we prepare for execution?" "All of them," Krextar repeated, his voice carrying the cold fury of a tyrant whose authority had been challenged. "Every slave, every prisoner, every civilian we can capture. We will broadcast their deaths across every star system in this sector. Let the galaxy see what happens when someone dares to defy us." On the USS Vengeance, Dr. Karen Price detected the change in Vorthak communications immediately. Her xenobiology training included expertise in reading the behavioral patterns of various alien species, and what she saw in the intercepted transmissions terrified her. "Captain, the Vorthak are activating what they call execution vessels. Based on their communications, they're planning mass executions of civilian populations." Captain Morrison felt ice form in his veins. This was the moment he had been dreading. Victory in space was meaningless if it led to genocide on the planet. "How many prisoners are we talking about?" "Sir, based on population estimates and the size of their mobile execution facilities, they could kill millions of people in a matter of hours. They have ships specifically designed for mass executions, complete with broadcast equipment to transmit the deaths across the galaxy." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of command like never before. Every decision he had made had led to this moment. The Vorthak were prepared to commit mass murder rather than accept defeat. "Ryan, where are these execution vessels?" Chief Tactical Officer Ryan Clark highlighted multiple ships on the tactical display. 12 vessels positioned around the planet. They're beginning to move toward the major population centers now. Time until they reach attack positions? 18 minutes, sir. 18 minutes to prevent a genocide. Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew, seeing the same determination he felt burning in their eyes. They had come to this system to answer a distress call, and they would not allow their intervention to become the cause of mass slaughter. "All hands, this is the captain," Morrison announced over the ship's communication system. "The enemy is attempting to execute civilian populations in retaliation for their defeat. This crosses every line of civilized warfare. We are now operating under Protocol 7. Protocol 7 was humanity's response to war crimes in progress. It authorized the complete destruction of enemy forces engaged in genocide. with no consideration for proportional response or diplomatic consequences. Harper. Plot intercept courses for all 12 execution vessels. Tony, I need maximum power to all weapon systems. Commander Lisa Harper worked with desperate efficiency to calculate the complex orbital mechanics required to intercept 12 different targets across the planet's orbit. Captain, the targets are spread across too wide an area. We can't reach all of them before they begin executions. Then we prioritize the largest population centers and work our way down, Morrison replied grimly. In engineering, Chief Tony Martinez pushed the USS Vengeance's systems beyond their design limits. The quantum reactors were already operating at dangerous levels, but Protocol 7 authorized any action necessary to prevent genocide. Captain, I can give you full power, but the quantum matrix is showing stress fractures. We might only get one full salvo before the weapons need time to cool down. Make it count, Morrison ordered. The USS Vengeance accelerated toward the first execution vessel with a speed that defied the laws of physics as understood by most species. The ship's experimental propulsion systems, designed by humanity's best engineers, allowed maneuvers that seemed impossible to observers. The first quantum cannon blast struck the execution vessel amidships, not merely disabling it, but completely, destroying the ship's ability to harm anyone ever again. The vessel's hull integrity failed as quantum forces disrupted the molecular bonds holding it together. But even as the first target was eliminated, Morrison could see the remaining 11 execution vessels continuing their approach toward populated areas. Time was running out. Sir, Operations Officer Steve Collins reported from his station, I'm detecting massive prisoner transfers on several of the remaining vessels. They're consolidating their captives to maximize the psychological impact of the executions. Morrison realized that the Vorthak were not just planning to kill people. They were staging a deliberate atrocity designed to traumatize anyone who witnessed it. The executions would be broadcast across the galaxy as a warning to other species who might consider rebellion. Medical Officer Dr. Patricia Wade, Morrison called over the communication system, prepare all medical bays for mass casualty treatment. We're going to save as many as we can. The second and third execution vessels fell to quantum cannon fire, their hulls torn apart by forces that reduced matter to its component atoms. But the USS Vengeance was paying a price for the rapid engagement. The ship's shields were draining. Power and the weapon systems were overheating. Captain, Harper reported, shield strength is down to 40%. The remaining execution vessels are beginning coordinated evasive maneuvers. The Vorthak commanders had realized that their psychological warfare tactics were useless against the human ship. Now they were fighting for their lives, using every trick they knew to avoid the devastating quantum weapons. But they had made a critical error. By threatening civilian populations, they had crossed humanity's ultimate red line. Captain Morrison was no longer fighting a battle for territory or resources. This was a battle for the fundamental principles that defined human civilization. All remaining execution vessels are now priority targets, Morrison announced. We will not allow genocide to occur on our watch. The USS Vengeance's quantum cannons fired again, reaching across impossible distances to strike enemies who thought they were safe. One by one, the execution vessels died in flashes of disrupted matter, their crews and their terrible purpose eliminated by the righteous fury of humanity's most advanced warship. In the end, it took 14 minutes to destroy all 12 execution vessels. 14 minutes that felt like hours to every person on the USS Vengeance's bridge. When the last execution ship disappeared in a quantum cascade, the bridge fell silent except for the steady hum of overloaded systems. All execution vessels destroyed. Clark reported quietly. No civilian casualties. Morrison nodded, but he knew the battle was far from over. By crossing the line into genocide, the Vorthak had forced humanity to respond with overwhelming force. The galaxy would remember this day, but the question remained. Would they remember it as liberation or as the beginning of a larger war? On the planet below, millions of freed beings looked up at the sky where a human ship had just prevented their extinction. For the first time in 30 years, they could imagine a future where freedom was possible. The silence that followed the destruction of the execution vessels was profound. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Vengeance, looking at a tactical display that showed the scattered remains of what had once been the most feared fleet in this sector of the galaxy. Admiral Krextor's flagship drifted powerless, its crew trapped aboard a ship that could no longer threaten anyone. But Morrison knew that military victory was only the beginning. 17 civilizations had just been freed from 30 years of oppression, and the power vacuum left behind could be as dangerous as the tyranny it replaced. "Dr. Price," he said, turning to the xenobiologist, "what's the situation on the planet?" Dr. Karen Price had been monitoring communications from the surface throughout the battle. What she had observed was both encouraging and troubling. "Captain, the liberation is proceeding faster than anyone expected. Vorthak ground forces are surrendering in most areas. But we're also seeing some concerning developments. Such as? Some of the liberated species are calling for revenge against their former oppressors. There are reports of Vorthak prisoners being executed in retaliation for 30 years of abuse. The cycle of violence could continue even after we've broken their military power." Morrison felt the familiar weight of command responsibility. It was not enough to win battles. True victory required building something better from the ruins of what had been destroyed. "Open a channel to Thela and any other resistance leaders who can hear us." Lieutenant Amanda Foster worked to establish communication with the planet's surface. "Channel open, Captain." This is Captain Morrison to all. Liberation forces on Kepler 442b. I want to speak directly about what happens next. The voice that responded was Thyla's, but Morrison could hear other beings in the background, representing the 17 different species that had been enslaved together. "We hear you, Captain. Our people are free because of your intervention. We are in your debt." "No," Morrison said firmly. "You are not in anyone's debt. Freedom is not something that can be owned or owed. It's a right that belongs to every thinking being in the galaxy." He paused, choosing his words carefully. What he said next would shape the future of 17 civilizations. "I need to tell you something about humanity's intentions. We did not come here to conquer or to replace the Vorthak as your rulers. We came because you asked for help, and helping people who need it is what humans do." Intelligence Officer Nicole Baker had been analyzing data from across the Vorthak Empire while the battle raged. Her findings painted a picture of an interstellar tyranny that extended far beyond this single system. "Captain," she reported quietly, "I'm detecting quantum communication signals from at least 40 other star systems under Vorthak control. Word of what happened here is spreading. We're receiving distress calls from enslaved populations across the sector." Morrison closed his eyes for a moment. 40 systems, hundreds of billions of enslaved beings. The scope of the problem was overwhelming, but he knew that humanity could not turn away from suffering simply because it was widespread. "Thyla," he continued over the communication channel, "we need to discuss what happens when the Vorthak send reinforcements." "And they will send reinforcements." "Captain Morrison." came the voice of Vexmon, the Korath engineer. "My people have been analyzing the technical data from the Vorthak ships you disabled. We believe we can adapt their technology to build defensive systems for our worlds." This was exactly what Morrison had hoped to hear. The key to lasting freedom was not permanent protection by outside forces, but the ability of liberated peoples to defend themselves. "That's good to hear, Vexmon, but defense is only part of the solution. What I want to propose is something that has never existed in this part of the galaxy. A voluntary alliance based on mutual cooperation rather than conquest or submission." Lieutenant Commander Greg Thompson had been working on the legal and diplomatic framework for exactly this situation. Human military doctrine included detailed plans for post-liberation governance that respected the sovereignty of freed peoples. "Sir," Thompson reported, "I've been drafting what we're calling the Kepler Accords. It's a mutual defense agreement that preserves the independence of each member species while providing collective security against future threats." Morrison nodded. "Thyla, Vexmon, and any other leaders who are listening, here's what humanity offers. We will share our military technology with you, not as weapons of conquest, but as tools of defense. We will provide training and support to help you build your own fleets. Most importantly, we will stand with you when the Vorthak return with larger forces." "But what do you want in return?" asked a new voice, speaking for one of the species Morrison had not heard from before. "Nothing that you would not freely give," Morrison replied. "We ask only that you extend the same protection to others that we are offering to you. When other enslaved systems call for help, we hope you will answer as we answered your call." The concept was revolutionary for this part of the galaxy. Every major power operated on principles of domination and submission. The idea of an alliance between equals, where members retained their independence while supporting each other, was unprecedented. "Captain," Thyla's voice carried a note of wonder, "you're talking about something that has never existed. A confederation of free peoples who choose to work together." "It exists in human space," Morrison explained. "Earth belongs to an alliance of over 30 different species, all independent, all equal. We've learned that diversity makes us stronger, not weaker." On the tactical display, Morrison could see Vorthak ships throughout the system powering down their weapons and requesting terms for surrender. The psychological foundation of their empire had been shattered, and without fear to enforce their will, they had no effective means of control. "Sir," Clark reported, "we're receiving surrender requests from 63 Vorthak vessels. They're asking for terms." Morrison considered his options carefully. These beings had participated in 30 years of systematic oppression, but they were also sentient creatures whose lives had value. More importantly, how humanity treated defeated enemies would send a message to the entire galaxy about what kind of civilization they were. "Inform them that surrender will be accepted under the following conditions: immediate cessation of all hostile activities, full disclosure of Vorthak military capabilities and territorial claims, and cooperation in the transition to self-governance for all formerly enslaved populations." "And if they refuse?" Harper asked. "Then they face the same fate as the execution vessels. But I believe most of them will choose to surrender. Fear was their weapon, and that weapon no longer works." Dr. Patricia Wade had been coordinating medical assistance for liberated prisoners throughout the engagement. Her reports painted a picture of the systematic abuse that the Vorthak had inflicted on their captives. "Captain, I'm treating beings who haven't seen proper medical care in decades. Some of them don't believe they're actually free." 30 years of oppression doesn't end just because the oppressor's fleet is defeated. Morrison understood. Physical. Liberation was only the first step. True freedom would require time, support, and the patient rebuilding of civilizations that had been systematically destroyed. Dr. Wade, what do you need to establish proper medical facilities on the planet? Time, supplies, and cooperation from the liberated populations. Some of the species have medical knowledge that could be invaluable, but they've been forbidden to practice for so long that they've almost forgotten their own healing traditions. This was another piece of the puzzle. The Vorthak had not just enslaved bodies. They had tried to erase cultures, traditions, and knowledge. Rebuilding would require rediscovering what had been lost. "Thyla," Morrison said into the communication channel, "we want to help you rebuild not just your defenses but your civilizations, your art, your science, your cultures, everything the Vorthak tried to destroy." The response that came back was filled with emotion. "Captain Morrison, some of our people have forgotten the songs our ancestors sang. Our children have never seen the colors of our traditional ceremonies. You offer us something more precious than military protection. You offer us the chance to remember who we are." Morrison looked around his bridge at the faces of his crew. They had come to this system expecting a simple rescue mission. Instead, they had sparked the beginning of something much larger. The transformation of an entire region of the galaxy from a collection of enslaved worlds to a confederation of free peoples. "The Kepler Accords are just the beginning," he announced. "Today, 17 civilizations chose freedom. Tomorrow, we help them build something that will ensure freedom endures." 6 months had passed since the USS Vengeance first entered the Kepler system. The red sun that had once cast shadows of despair over enslaved populations now illuminated construction sites where 17 different species worked together to build a new future. Captain Morrison stood on the observation deck of the newly constructed Kepler station, watching Korath engineers collaborate with Zilani telepaths to install defensive systems that combined the best of both technologies. It was a sight that would have been impossible under Vorthak rule, where different species had been deliberately kept separate to prevent cooperation. "Captain," Commander Harper approached with a datapad containing the latest intelligence reports. "You're going to want to see this." Morrison took the pad and studied the information with growing amazement. The quantum communication networks that connected Vorthak space were carrying news of the Kepler liberation to every corner of their former empire. The results were exactly what he had hoped for and feared. 43 systems have declared independence from Vorthak rule, Harper reported. Enslaved populations across the sector are rising up, using the techniques and strategies that were broadcast from here. But the news was not entirely positive. However, the Vorthak High Command has declared the Kepler system a rebel stronghold and is assembling the largest fleet in their history to retake it. Intelligence estimates over 1,000 ships. Morrison nodded grimly. They had known this day would come. The Vorthak could not allow the successful rebellion to stand because it proved that their system of control could be broken. If Kepler remained free, every enslaved world in the galaxy would eventually follow its example. "What's our defensive capability?" "Better than expected," Harper replied with a slight smile. The Kepler Defense Force now includes ships from all 17 species, armed with quantum weapons based on our technology. Thyla's telepathic coordination abilities have created a level of fleet integration that's unprecedented in galactic warfare. Through the station's windows, Morrison could see the evidence of their success. Sleek ships built by Korath engineers, moved in perfect coordination with vessels designed by 12 other species, their formations guided by Zalani telepaths who could share tactical information instantly across the entire fleet. But more importantly, these were not the same beings who had been enslaved 6 months ago. They fought now not just for survival, but for the preservation of something precious, the knowledge that freedom was possible. "Sir," Lieutenant Amanda Foster's voice came over the station's communication system. "We are receiving a transmission from Earth Command. Priority Alpha." Morrison made his way to the communication center, where Foster had established a quantum link with human space. The face that appeared on the screen was Admiral Sarah Mitchell, his superior officer and one of the architects of humanity's expansion into the galaxy. "Jake," Admiral Mitchell said without preamble, "what you've accomplished in the Kepler system has implications far beyond anything we anticipated. The entire galactic balance of power is shifting." "Yes, ma'am. We're tracking similar liberation movements in over 40 systems. It's more than that. We're receiving diplomatic inquiries from species we've never had contact with before. Some are asking for alliance agreements. Others are warning us that we've started a war that could consume the entire galaxy." Morrison felt the weight of unintended consequences. They had answered a distress call and ended up triggering a galactic revolution. "What are your orders, Admiral?" "That's the interesting part, Jake. For the first time in human military history, Earth Command is asking a field commander to make policy decisions. What happens in the Kepler system will determine whether humanity becomes a galactic liberator or a galactic conqueror. The choice is yours." The screen went dark, leaving Morrison alone with the most important decision of his life. Around him, the station bustled with activity as representatives from 17 species worked to prepare for the coming battle. But this was about more than one battle, or even one war. This was about the kind of galaxy they wanted to create. He made his way to the main conference room, where the leaders of the Kepler Alliance were gathered around a holographic display of local space. Thyla sat beside Vexmon, their former enemies now united by shared purpose. Representatives from 15 other species filled the remaining seats, each bringing unique perspectives and capabilities. "My friends," Morrison began, "we need to make some decisions about what we're fighting for." Thyla looked up from the tactical display. "Captain, our scouts report that the Vorthak fleet will arrive in this system within 2 weeks. We can defeat them, but the cost will be enormous." "That's not the only consideration," added Vexmon. "If we destroy the Vorthak fleet, we become the dominant military power in this sector. Other species will either ally with us out of fear, or form coalitions to oppose us. We could end up replacing the Vorthak Empire with something just as oppressive." Morrison had been thinking about this exact problem for months. Military superiority was not the same as moral authority. The galaxy was watching to see whether the beings who had broken Vorthak power would use that power responsibly. "There's another option," he said carefully. "What if we don't try to defeat the Vorthak fleet at all?" The room fell silent as the implications sank in. They had the capability to win a defensive battle, but Morrison was suggesting something entirely different. "I'm listening," Thyla said quietly. "The Vorthak Empire is based on fear and the belief that resistance is impossible. But look around this room. 17 species that were enemies before the conquest are now working together as equals. We've proven that cooperation is stronger than domination." Morrison activated the holographic display, showing the positions of the rebellions that were spreading across Vorthak space. Every day we delay the final battle, more systems declare independence. The Vorthak are losing their empire not through military defeat, but through the simple realization that freedom is possible. Vexmon's breathing apparatus hissed softly as he considered the idea. You're suggesting we let them come here, but instead of fighting them, we try to convince them to join us? Not just convince, Morrison replied. Demonstrate. Show them what 17 free civilizations can accomplish when they work together. Show them that there's an alternative to the system they've been defending. It was the most audacious strategy any of them had ever heard. Instead of preparing for the largest space battle in galactic history, they would try to win through example rather than force. Captain, said a representative from one of the smaller species, what if it doesn't work? What if they attack anyway? Morrison's answer was simple. Then we defend ourselves, but we try the peaceful option first. The vote was unanimous. The Kepler Alliance would prepare for battle, but they would also prepare for something unprecedented in galactic history, an attempt to end an empire through conversion rather than conquest. 2 weeks later, the Vorthak fleet arrived at the edge of the Kepler system. 1,000 ships arranged in the traditional fear formation that had broken the will of countless civilizations. But instead of being met with military resistance, they encountered something that had never happened before in the history of their empire. They were invited to a conference. The message that went out to the Vorthak fleet was broadcast on every frequency, in every language spoken in the galaxy. It was simple and direct. To the commanders and crews of the Vorthak fleet, you are invited to witness what 17 civilizations have built together in 6 months of freedom. See for yourself what cooperation can accomplish. Judge whether the galaxy you are fighting to preserve is worth preserving. Captain Morrison stood on the bridge of the USS Vengeance, watching as Vorthak ships slowly began to accept the invitation. Not all of them, but enough to matter. Ship by ship, crew by crew, the Vorthak Empire began to discover that there was an alternative to the only system they had ever known. The revolution that had begun with a single distress call was spreading not through weapons of war, but through weapons of hope. Across the galaxy, enslaved peoples were learning that freedom was not just a dream, but an achievable reality. And in the Kepler system, under the light of a red sun that no longer cast shadows of fear, 17 civilizations continued building, something that had never existed before. A truly free society where differences were celebrated rather than suppressed. The age of empires was ending. The age of alliances had begun. In the end, it was not the firepower of the USS Vengeance that changed the galaxy. It was the simple demonstration that there was a better way to live, and that beings from anywhere in the universe could choose that better way if they had the courage to reach for it. Captain Morrison had answered a distress call and ended up answering a question that had haunted civilized beings for millennia: whether freedom was stronger than fear. The answer, written in quantum fire across the stars, was yes.